Hey everyone, we're back and we are continuing on with the Shroud of Turin. And so the question then becomes, is there a history to this shroud? And if we go back in the history, we find that there is this famous cloth of Edessa, and there's a picture of it above me, um, being held by King Abgar of Edessa, who was a contemporary of Jesus, meaning he was around at the same time. And so the story goes that King Abgar got very sick and he heard about this healer down in Galilee. And so he sent word for this miracle worker to come. But yet, when he sends word down, Jesus has already died. And so we have the story of Thaddeus or Jude, one of the apostles, brings a cloth to King Abgar, and it immediately heals him. And so this cloth then becomes um, this focus um, in the town of Edessa. And suddenly now, this town out in way up in Syria becomes this hotbed for Christian conversion. And there's really no reason why there should have been. Now, this cloth was seen as a face cloth with the face of Jesus on it. But that doesn't really match with our Shroud of Turin, which is a full body length. So we'll have to think about that for a minute. Hold that on the side. But there is one answer. One of the ancient words that's associated with the cloth of Edessa is tetradiplon, which means doubled in four. And if you take the shroud and you double it in four, all you're left with is a cross section of the shroud with the face of Jesus in the middle. So it seems like that's how, if it is the shroud, that is how it was stored or like viewed, was not the full body image, but just the face cloth or just the face of Jesus. Um, so then in 944, it moved to Constantinople, where Gregory Referendarius, an archdeacon, gave this sermon that they just recently discovered, mentioning the Edessa cloth, that it actually contained a full image. And the reason it doesn't really say, hey, this cloth had a full image, it said it spoke that the Edessa cloth spoke specifically of the bloodstains of the side wound. Well, why would a face cloth be able to tell about the side wound unless it were a full body image? Really fascinating. Also, the text from the ancient Egyptian church in the third and fourth century, which mentions bodies, how to wrap bodies, and it says that they're to be wrapped in shrouds of aromatic spices. And here's the quote that's really interesting: "As Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, these are followers of Jesus, had done with the body of the Lord, as the shroud shows." What are they talking about there, if not the shroud of Turin? And why would it show unless they were talking about the image of Jesus? There's also a report of a French knight of the First Crusade in 1203 that says, hey, I saw this. But then what we get to is that Constantinople is sacked in 1204, and all references to the cloth of Edessa end right there. And so then we get to the shroud. There's this, we get firm confirmation of the shroud, the one that we know, the one is in Turin right now. We know that it's been there since, or we know where it has been since 1355, or about that time. But what about those missing years between 1204 and 1355, if we're willing to say that the cloth of Edessa is in fact the Shroud of Turin? So we have a little bit of guessing here. The Crusader Othon de la Roche claimed that he brought the shroud back from Constantinople in 1206. And there's a wooden box above me here. It's from the 13th century. It is currently owned by the descendants of de la Roche in this castle in France. And it has the inscription, "This casket preserved in the castle of Ray, the shroud of Christ, brought by Othon de la Roche from Constantinople in 1206. That's pretty good. So keeping going here. It's It's been established from the documents in the Vatican by researchers that the shroud was also in the care of the Knights Templar, who were constantly taking artifacts from the Middle East back to Europe. And it was used, that the shroud was used in their initiation rites. Several crusaders claim to have seen it. But here's our connection. 5th century ancestor of a woman named Jeanne de Verger. She was the wife of the great knight and crusader Geoffrey de Charnay. He's referred to by the enemy British side as the bravest and most worthy of them all. So, like when your enemies in such a bloody time period as the 13th century, when your enemies are referring to you as the bravest and most worthy of them all, you're a quality individual. The reference here is that in 1355, that Geoffrey de Charnay reveals the burial shroud of Christ to the bishop, and at this point, the history of the shroud is certain. So you have there the wife of Geoffrey de Charnay, Jeanne de Verger, sorry about my French, is a 5th century ancestor of Othin de la Roche. So you have that family connection all the way through. And then in 1355, we have our shroud. Here you have, over here you have this souvenir medallion. So like you go to Disney World and get a button. Here you have a medallion from the Church of Lyre, which was the church established by Geoffrey de Charnay, and this has the crests of Charnay and Verger, the husband and wife, and the image of the shroud on it. As you can see, this is how the shroud is. It's this long piece of cloth with one side is the front and one side is the back, and here it is. So this would have been something that you would have gotten as kind of a medallion saying, "Hey, I went there," and here it does have that. So I think it pretty much answers the issues of you know taking the story of the shroud from the very beginning, if we can trust the legends, all the way through to the shroud we have now. Okay, so now I want to ruin everything. In 1988, Shroud was carbon dated. Carbon dating is a test that can tell how much of an isotope carbon-14 the organic material has left following the laws of radioactive decay. And then you can determine how old a thing is. So it was determined then. They took and cut a piece of the cloth, and they divided it into three and sent some to England, some to the United States, and some to Germany. And they had these carbon dating tests done. And when they finished up all their tests, it was they've discovered and concluded that this shroud could only be as old as 1260 to 1390. And so, therefore, they declared it a forgery, that the shroud was just a forgery. So then, really, what are we talking about this? At the time in the Middle Ages, there were all kinds of forgeries of all different kinds of famous artifacts. So it makes sense that that could have been the case here, right? That this was just simply a forgery. So why then are we still talking about it? If in 1988, long before any of you guys were born, um, it was a forgery. We'll talk about that next.